Hi, this is Claudia Luis Vera, and I'm here with Slop Happens, here also with Bianca Prince.
Hi, everybody. And we're happy to see you again today on this show.
So today we're going to dive into probably one of my favorite stories or favorite cautionary tales about misuse of data. And this is one that doesn't get talked about a lot. It actually is, it happened in 2004, but it's every bit as true today, 20 plus years later, in terms of how you could gather data, you can completely misuse it and use that data as a tool of oppression. So imagine you're in the Americas and you're in a country under a strongman who's not particularly popular. There's a strong opposition to them, but there's no way of removing this person from power. And we're talking, in this case, we're talking about Venezuela, and we're talking about Hugo Chavez back in the 2000s. And in 2002, there had been a coup. The military took over for like a day and a half. And basically, Hugo Chavez managed to work his way back into power. So 2 years later, the opposition is looking for some sort of way of removing him from power. And there's a legal means in the Venezuelan constitution where if you get a petition with enough signatures, you can force a referendum to see if you vote him out of power. So just like you have people getting you to sign petitions outside supermarkets or outside the DMV or something, in Venezuela, they set up a campaign to get more than 20% of registered voters to sign this petition.
And this was an online petition. This was not a physical petition. This was an online petition, wasn't it?
No, this is a physical petition where you're going out and you're gathering signatures.
Okay.
And so the bar is set pretty high. I mean, 20% of registered voters, that's a lot of signatures. In fact, it was like 2.4 million. So they went out and the opposition went out and they gathered more than the 2.4 million signatures that they needed to be able to force this referendum. And as you can imagine, you know, if you're on the side that doesn't favor the referendum, you're going to say, well, this was fake. You've padded the signatures. This is not true. This is fraud. So you're going to go out and you're going to make them prove that these signatures are legitimate. So the opposition did exactly that. You know, you had the opportunity to go and confirm your signature with your with a thumbprint, with a fingerprint, and showing your cédula, your national ID, with a number. So you have, in the end, you ended up with a confirmed list of over 20% of the population that wanted this referendum to happen. So in the end, well, what ended up happening with this list? So there was enough to force a referendum. They made the referendum happen. It was a vote. Should Hugo Chavez stay in power or should he be ousted? And they didn't have enough votes to be able to force Chavez out of government. But they did have more than 20%. So what Chavez ended up doing and what his backers did is they assembled a national database with all those signatures. Mm-hmm. And it ended up in the hands of a particularly online congressman who is a particularly ardent backer of Chavez, Luis Tascón. And Luis Tascón leaked the signatures. He created this database and set it up on his website where this is 2004. You've got rotating GIFs. You've got, you know, frames. You've got like this vintage 2004 website. And there it is. You can enter somebody's cédula number and see how they voted. And this was then started to use as a tool. It's like, well, I'm hiring somebody. Which way does he lean politically? Oh, let me go check Luis Tascón's website. So after a few weeks of this, people got absolutely incensed. And they say, no, we got to take this down. So they do the takedown. And then what ended up happening is that the Chavistas took that data and instead of publishing it publicly, they burned it onto CD-ROMs. And they distributed those CD-ROMs as an app. So you go into the CD-ROM app, you type in somebody's cellular number, and it tells you exactly, whether or not how they had voted on the referendum, or it tells you whether they had signed the petition or not. And that was used as a tool for anybody who was applying for any services from the government or any sort of job with the government, if you were applying for credit. And essentially, if you had registered and confirmed yourself as part of the opposition, then you were blacklisted. And this is something that it happened in 2004. Yeah, sure, it was a CD-ROM, but you could take any sort of information with somebody's political leaning and use that to blacklist. And this is something that, could or does happen in the United States, or could or does happen in any other country. And this is one of the reasons why I really wanted for you and I to be able to unpack the story.
So let me bring this story back to a few key points.
Okay.
Because it was a whole story, and for our listeners, it's good to bring this back. So we're talking about a petition which was originally about having a vote on a specific topic,
right?
A referendum in this case, and for that there was data.
Right.
It wasn't 2004; it's 22 years further. But This case also shows that data protection and specific related to political preferences has no aging limit, because we still have this today. Because they used a petition, and specifically what they did is make the information available to check if people had a specific political preference or affiliation, in this case being a member, having voted for the referendum, and then use that to oppress this group of people by denying them access to employment, to bank loans and stuff like that. So technically, you signed a petition, and because of your political affiliation, you ended up being excluded from parts of society. That's the 3 points we effectively have here.
So the third point is really something I want to dive into, which is that if you are in power and you hold the purse strings and you run the budget and you run hiring, it's not okay to say, we're just not going to spend money, or we're not going to hire people who are not aligned with us. And that's something that's happened here in the U.S. ever since the inauguration day of this last administration.
Yeah, and that is one thing I think is worrying, because in essence, it's something which you connect to a country like Russia.
Right.
And not to the U.S. But now, these days, it is of interest. And you see that impact of having this information calls for additional measures to make sure that this information should be safe. It should be safe who you vote for, what your political preferences are. Because if that is not safe anymore, how can people trust the system? And I think that is, in essence, what the Tascón case is about. It's about trust in politics.
So yes, when Luis Tascón released that list, that was a blatant misuse of the information. So the information is there, like a collection of over 2.4 million people with their signatures saying, we want a certain outcome, or we want this referendum to happen. And then in Latin America, to connect that with some sort of biometric, that's not uncommon. Like if I sign a contract, or if I sign an affidavit or legal papers in a country like Venezuela or Peru, where I've had to do a lot of that, it's not unusual to have to, get a biometric, to get some sort of hologram that also links into it. So these are all sort of, I would say, like security theater, very performative sort of ways of showing that the authenticity of that sort of document, because it's very common for people to say, well, whatever you signed or whatever you there is fake, it's not authentic, it's a forgery. And so this sort of performative anti-forgery stuff is common. So getting people to come back in to, say, a police station or a government office to add a thumbprint and fingerprint their signature. Like, that is something that kind of follows in Latin America, where you want to say, yes, absolutely, we want to prove that these signatures aren't fraudulent. The misuse then comes later in terms of what do you do with that data, that information.
Yeah, but I think it's also about how you store this. Because if I look at it with my ethical view on things, I would say, okay, it's good that you have the proof behind the signature, that the signature is real, it's not rigged, and people really signed up. But do we really need to keep the information on signing and the proof of authenticity in the same file? I think that is one big question which comes in, and not just in the case of 22 years ago, because digitalization was not as far as it is today. But for example, today, you have digital passports popping up. If you prove that you are you in a signature on governmental level, for example, or a referendum, then it should not be visible what you voted for. So that means there's two things in there. One, in this case, and that's specifically for the US too, you have to be a registered voter. You have, if you want to participate in any political event which is related to the Republican or Democratic Party, you have to be registered, meaning you cannot have a say in who's going to be the presidential candidate without that registration. So people know if you're a Democrat or Republican. Well, in the Netherlands, nobody knows.
Nobody knows. But
No.
so let's take this one level further, because in Latin American countries like in Peru and Ecuador, your ID, your national ID, is your voter registration card. So you have to go as an adult and register yourself to vote, and that boleta electoral, that little electoral booklet, becomes your cédula, which becomes your ID and your number and your identifier of you as a citizen of this country. So,
but then a question for me on that process.
mm-hmm.
Does that mean that it is an election card? Specifically, it's connected to allow you to enter the voting system, but does it also register your political preference?
That's a good question. I'm sure it varies country by country, but it essentially, voting is mandatory in in countries like Peru. So you're expected to vote or have a good reason or excuse for not voting. So it's kind of like jury duty. It's seen as your responsibility as a citizen. I would presume that it would have been the same thing in Venezuela, but you have the biometric with it, the fingerprint, which in 2004, a fingerprint on paper was probably just a fingerprint. You weren't going to be using that to unlock laptops. You weren't going to be using that as a biometric, as another token in data for security back in 2004. So since then, now that we have these sort of biometrics, we've evolved all these sort of ethics around how do we use those biometrics well. And I'm sure, in Europe with GDPR as of 2018, that's probably very tightly regulated.
Yeah, but the thing is, we also have when you want to participate and have a vote,
right?
You receive a voting card. You get that in the Netherlands. You get it by mail, and then little mail, so not your email. It's a physical card you get in your
Right.
mailbox, and it differs per country. But a lot of the countries still have the physical card. The physical card, you bring that into the voting station. They take it in, they check it with your passport. Are you the correct person? You get your passport
Right.
back, and the card gets in the box. That's being secured because so they know that you are allowed to vote. So every time this card has been taken in, if you don't use it, you cannot use it with the next elections because it's dated, it's stamped, and it changes all over the time. So that is one part. So it's always proven that your vote is legal.
So that's interesting. So it's a physical card. They're just like, it's a voting coupon. So in the States, you get a voter registration card, which says, I'm Claudio, I belong to this party, and my voting place, my polls, my voting precinct that I need to report to is at such and such an address.
Yeah.
But I use that in combination with my hard government issued ID to be able to go there and vote.
Yeah. And then the voting pass has been taken in. So you cannot go vote twice. You can only vote once. If you flip it for the Netherlands, you can even put in...
the card is just there for my convenience. And I don't turn that in, and there's no requirement in the States to turn that in. So that's interesting that you would use a voting card as like basically a pass that lets you go in.
It's a voting pass, exactly. That's it.
Like a ticket.
Yeah, it's a ticket that you can only vote. You only get a ballot with that pass. And only if you give the pass. So if you don't want to give it over, you're not going to get a ballot. So you cannot vote. And those are two separate systems. So it means that everybody who casted the vote has the legal right to cast the vote.
Right.
And the votes are not possibly connected to a person. And that means for a referendum, in our case, we had one or two. We only had a few, and it was yes or no. And okay, but for that, the system was still the same. So you got the voting pass. You had to bring it to the polling station. They take it in. They check it with your passport. Your passport is returned, and you get a ballot after that process. Meaning there's three people sitting literally at the table. One takes in the pass. The second one holds your passport. They check it together. So it's a 4-eye principle.
Right.
And then if the 4-eye principle says yes, you get your ballot. That's technically, it goes quite fast, but it really works well. And it's a secured system. So you know that, and that's what I meant with the data from voting versus the proof of reality, of being allowed to vote. Those two need to be separated to be trusted. And also to protect people's freedom of expression, freedom of voting, freedom of decision making. Without these two, I think actually that's one of the key things which I take out of the Tascón case, is actually if you put in all that information in one file, it's easy to abuse information against people.
So what there has to be like a firewall in between the actual content of what you're voting for and the identifying whether somebody has the right to vote in that situation. And a petition in particular is very susceptible because it doesn't necessarily have the same sort of protections that an actual vote or a ballot would have.
No, exactly. And I think that is one of the things, if you work with petitions these days, and often they go online. I mean, if it's a physical petition, like you go into the store, there's somebody asking you to sign up for the local dog shelter, you sign up and you think like, hey, that's a good thing. But if you think about specific political topics and you put that in a petition today, in today's society, online, and if you don't want to be seen publicly shared your name, it also, the data should be protected, meaning that, yes, I have to prove that all the signatures are true, but we have about 50% of the people signed without showing their name. If you really need it, we can prove they're real, but we're not going to give you personal information for that. And I think, and yes, it can be, for example, via a notary that does a check, and yes, then you have to, but the notary also has a legal obligation to protect privacy. So if you have something like that in the middle, any form of petition in today's world could not have the effect the Tascón List had, because you do not have access to private information of the people who signed, so you don't know what they voted for.
Right. So the Tascón List, you know what they voted for because, like there's one question on the petition, which is, should we have this referendum? And it's a pretty...
Or not.
Exactly. Well, if not, then you wouldn't sign the petition. But you're putting your name and you're putting your hand up and saying,
No.
I oppose this government.
But
And
in
I
that
confirmed
case,
it.
you should have the right to not show your name.
Right. And which then starts kind of bringing all sorts of questions. So those folks who are gathering the signatures need to somehow be certified or somehow be trustworthy of being able to gather signatures and identifying those people with the same sort of trust that you would provide to a voting precinct.
Exactly. And I think that is one of the crucial things of voting or signing a petition. There needs to be trust, and data on personal choices should be protected. So, in the case of having only one option, I signed this petition because I want to have a referendum,
Right.
which means that everybody who signs is against whatever thing is being said in the referendum. That means that you have to protect all identities by default. And if people want to speak out and want to say, hey, I'm Klaas and I am against whatever,
Right.
fine, then it's Klaas's decision to be out and open in the public, and that it's fine that this information is shared. But I think in a lot of cases, people do not think about it, that their public information is shared. So maybe we should start thinking about, and this is all in spirit of data protection and
Right.
having the freedom of expressing your opinion. And it doesn't matter if you're on the left or on the right. You should be able to do that. So yes, maybe we should think about a by default not showing a name to build trust.
I could see something like this happening around an issue where people have very strong feelings and where what you think is right one day could be turned into something that's wrong exactly. In the future. You take, for example, LGBT rights in Russia. And so if you were before Putin to say, like, I'm advocating for folks who are gay, I'm advocating for LGBT, you could be seen as socially progressive. But when Putin came in, he basically used people's reaction to pedophilia, and by basically tagging folks who are gay as pedophiles and conflating those two issues, he essentially initiated a backlash against LGBT. And basically, if you had identified yourself as LGBT or as an ally, you would then be susceptible to the backlash that was coming against this. And so what we're seeing, I think, in the U.S. is a regression, or we've seen a step back on a number of different issues that we never would have thought of. And, like, for instance, we were pretty far along with giving, transgender people rights, giving transgender people the freedom of opting out of binary, genders for legal documentation. All of that has been rolled back in the last couple of years. And so I could see how that would identify you as immediately as like, well, you're not aligned with our, with our thinking and our way of approaching stuff. So,
and beyond that, it's not just impacting people in the US. It's also impacting people from outside the US, because if you are transgender, or if you have the preference for an X in your passport, it's no longer allowed.
Right.
Meaning that if you want to get a visa for the US, you have to show your gender, which you don't have anymore because you transitioned, or you have to accept that you are male or female as you were born, even when you're intersexual.
I signed up a week or two ago for new health benefits online, and the form was very specific. I'm in Florida. The form very specifically said, what is your gender assigned at birth? And so, yeah, having that sort of dissonance between gender assigned at birth and the way you present yourself, I personally would hate to have to do that sort of explaining or live with that sort of dissonance day in and day out.
And it's even worse because if you if and that's something I learned from a transgender friend of mine, is that actually your previous gender and your previous name is a death name, meaning that you don't use it
Right.
anymore. You technically are forced back to an identity which is dead to you. So you're not accepting a person as. And I think that is so against so many human rights, but
I
also
agree.
just a simple ethical thing of accepting people for who they are. And that sounds a little bit distant, but in essence, that is what it is all about. I mean, if you do not accept a person in his, her gender, which is what fits to the person, versus you have to accept the gender you had at birth, it's literally not connecting to anything logical. So this one is really where I say, hey, why? Those are the tough topics.
So bringing it back to why I wanted to talk about Luis Tascón and his list.
Sorry for the deviation.
No, this is a great sidetrack. No, seriously, like I think the real point, and we've probably illustrated a bunch of different incidences of this that we didn't intend to, is that if you have information about someone, that information can be misused to blacklist someone. So if you're in a state where democracy is weak or the controls on government use of that information are weak, then that information potentially is something that could be used against you or something that could blacklist you. And the whole notion, I want to come back to this, and I can't stress this enough, the whole notion that you could take that information and say, well, we're not sending our money over to your state because you didn't vote for me in the election. Or, we're not spending money on you because you're not of our party and we don't feel like spending our money on people who are not of our party. Or we don't feel like spending money on you because you weren't born in this country. Or you don't have documentation to show that you're in this country legally. Because there's issues like that happening all the time now. So that notion that you can cherry pick who you can spend tax dollars on or who you allow services to, that's where things go wrong. And so if you combine that with information that is freely available to you, then that information becomes a tool of oppression.
But it also creates a whole new line of problems. And for example, the simple thing of denying people support or access to healthcare, which is a basic human right, because they're illegal, for example, because they got denied the permit to stay in the country, which can happen, but it's not always possible to return. Practically, we found that out in many cases. And in the Netherlands, we recently had a discussion about should this be a criminal a criminal case for justice? Yes.
What,
so it's
the
criminalized.
denying healthcare.
No, actually, being illegal, being criminalized. So you can be detained for being an illegal.
Right. So is your presence in a country without documentation,
Exactly.
Is it illegal? Is it a criminal act?
It's criminal act. That was the discussion. So being illegal, that's what can currently happen. But because even if you're illegal, you still have the right for healthcare. So there are specific doctors that help these groups, and that is that. And if it's really necessary, they are allowed to go to the hospital, and the hospital must help them. But if you make this a criminal act, and that not just being illegal, but also helping a person who is illegal, that means that people do not get the help they need anymore.
It puts an undue burden on the doctors. And then, spoiler, you have to share the same public transportation. You have to share the same railroads. You have to use the same public bathrooms. You have to, shop in the same supermarkets as people who aren't getting medical care. So from a public health point of view, it's just stupidity, because you're basically creating a group of people who, unfortunately, are being denied health care and then become a vector for epidemics or endemics.
But actually, the criminalization, that was, for example, that was one of the petitions I signed, that I was against criminalization of being illegal. And one of the things, I mean, our government is moving to the right also. Right. And what if this, in this case, I mean, now I'm saying it out, so everybody knows. But
you're saying it in public, right?
Yeah, I'm saying it in public, but also signed in public. But I chose to sign in public this petition, knowing that if any far-right party would say in the future, hey, you signed this, so you're on the bad side, or you don't get... I knew that, right? And I did it deliberately. But how many people signed such a petition without thinking about that consequence? I mean,
right here,
I think
here
about
you'd be called soft on immigration, and that would actually be brought up in an attack ad 2 or 3 years from now when you're running for a higher public office. Exactly.
And that in that case, I mean, even if there's going to be a discussion about asylum center here, for example, in our town, this can cut back to you because you signed a petition against. And that is one of the things, and I think that hits to one of the tricky things of politics, especially female politicians. Because if you look at the amount of attacks on decisions made or political preferences or personal preferences of female politicians, it's 2 to 3 times as worse as male politicians, meaning that all this information about preferences in voting, about preferences for political affiliations, we really have to take care of this better, in a better way, because if we don't do it, it also prevents future generations of people going into politics, and especially women, especially people from minority groups in any form. I mean,
right.
We have a current new president in the Netherlands, Rob Jetten. He is gay. And he is openly gay, he's proudly gay.
Congratulations.
Exactly. And he was even welcome in Trump's in Trump's White House, because it's his White House today. But he was there visiting with the Queen and the King. Technically it is, I know. But not according to him. But our King and Queen and our President were visiting. And the thing is that some people were even, but can he go in the Oval Office if he is gay? Because would he be... And I'm like, okay, but what does his being gay have to do with the fact? Because he is our prime minister. So if... Right, it doesn't matter who the prime minister is, or what his preference is, or if he dislikes cabbage, whatever, I don't know. He should be welcomed anyway, because it's respect to another country. It's respect to another politician. And I think that is what, if we look at all those things about voting, about being political active, that respect on the highest level, but also on the lowest level, of what do you vote for, which political party do you support, it should not impact your your public career or your private corporate career. I mean, that is one of the things I have been thinking about the last years. Can you be a member of a specific party and work in a large international bank? Yes, you can, I think.
Right.
And yes, I can be a member of the Green Party and work at one of Europe's largest banks.
Right.
Because I believe that it's also about the people within the bank changing the bank to be more green.
Right.
That's in essence how it works. But for that, you also need to be a little bit public about what you believe in. Because if you don't share what you believe in, you cannot be that change. So if I look at the whole thing we discussed and we started with, like signing a petition, knowing that your data is safe, and the fact that you signed versus your personal information should be kept separately, in combination with, yes, we need to make sure that we prove that all the signatures are right, and we can have that checked by an independent party who must keep private information private, who's legally obligated to do so, so say a notary in this case, making sure that your political affiliation does not impact what next steps you can make in your career, making sure you need closed data by default for any online petition. Make sure that you protect the information on a personal level, and make sure that if it's one question, it is closed voting, meaning that there's no information about who voted, because if it's only the question, like in the Tascón case, with the list there, then everybody who's on that list is a suspect. So you can only have a referendum question like that if it's closed voting. So it's never being showed who voted. Only the proof that the real people voted, because you have the checks.
So you're bringing up something that's kind of interesting, which is like, in order to protect democracy at the sort of grassroots level, to have petitions, like one of the key players would be some sort of third party clearinghouse that everybody trusts to count the votes, to know that they can certify or count the signatures on a petition. They can certify that the petition met its target of signatures, and then provide that information. It's trusted, and then they can go and destroy all the signatures. Like, that seems to be what would make the most sense.
Yeah. And then if you have it signed up with a notary, that means that it has been checked, it has been validated, so you have to trust the system in there. And I think this is one of the interesting where you can see that, I mean, we started this podcast, Slop Happens, based on what if tech fails on humans. And we see that it's not just high tech which fails on humans, but just the simple things we can all do now with technology, meaning that you can check if a person is the real person. You can do that by digital systems, but you can also do that by simple things as a fingerprint. But still, we have to make sure that all the data we collect is being protected in the right way, making sure that people, because it needs to be used in the right way, because otherwise tech will fail people and also will fail democracy.
Yeah, these are really important points. I think I see like 6 other follow-up episodes coming out of this, where we start getting into what are the biometrics that we use to identify people? Are those trustworthy enough? What do we do with data after the fact? What does if we were to bring democracy back, what does a proper solution look like? What sort of legislation should we be pushing for to protect ourselves against the misuse or blatant misuse of a petition or any sort of political information? Yeah, definitely these are future directions we should explore.
And let's first start with elections. I think that's the base of it. How can you trust elections?
Absolutely.
And look into that.
And this being an important election year here in the U.S., especially.
And we have elections too in the Netherlands. So we recently had one. for city council. So it's a good one to dive into that.
Awesome. Bianca, it's been great chatting with you today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us at Slop Happens.
Looking forward to see you next time.
Thanks. See you soon.
See you.